open. So welcome everyone. This is the ExpandED Circle Catalyst joint session with a brown bag on why rural matters for education in Texas. So welcome. We appreciate you being here. My screen's now advancing for some reason. It's interesting. Well, regardless, I'll just go ahead and introduce our speakers. So our two speakers today, let me stop share and reshare. Maybe that'll help. Our two speakers today are Dr. Devon Brenner. She's the Director of Social Science Research at Mississippi State University and a professor of teacher education. Her research focuses on rural education policy and practice. I know her as a director of the Education Policy Fellowship Program in Mississippi, and she's president of the National Rural Education Association. So everyone, thank you. Welcome, Dr. Brenner. Also, Dr. Karen Eppley is a teaching professor of literacies and English literature in the Department of Curriculum Instruction at Penn State. She is a former fifth grade teacher, yay. She prepares pre-service teachers to teach literacy in PK4 schools, and her scholarship explores rurality, economic globalization, rural literacies, rural teacher preparation, textual representations of rurality, and policy analysis. She is a co-author of Teaching in Rural Places, as you can see there on the right. And today they're going to talk a little bit about the Why Rural Matters report. And also interestingly, she edits the Journal of Research in Rural Education. So allow us to give a big warm welcome to our presenters. So feel free to start sharing your screen.
Why is it so laggy? I do not know why. Oh, there we go. The purple button. Okay, hello. Thank you for that introduction. I should start by saying that I am currently at Penn State. That is correct. But I am the incoming director of the Rural Education Center at Kansas State University. So I'll be making a move very shortly. So I think we're going to start today by giving you all some statewide context about rural education in the state of Texas. And to do that, I'm going to present a report called Why Rural Matters. Maybe you've heard of it. You can link to the entire report using that QR code if you want to use your phone. And the Texas state page is on 135. And what I mean by the Texas state page is the report is has maybe like, I don't know, like maybe 20 pages of some opening like overview US wide, kind of calling out important results from particular states, etc. And then really I think what most people are interested in is their own state page. So after kind of the opening verbiage, then the last 50 pages of the report or so are your own or results just for Texas. So that's what I'm going to be talking through. So this report has a very long history. It was first conceptualized in 1999 by the Rural School and Community Trust. That's an organization that goes way, way back. Marty Strange, I think, was the original founders or one of the original founders of that organization. They were interested a lot in preventing rural school closures and consolidations. I think that website's still kind of functional, but mostly that organization has been dissolved. And as part of that dissolution, Why Rural Matters has been transferred to National Rural Education Association. This has been a huge boost for this project, a huge boost in the presentation and the outreach potential. It's just been really, really great for this. For this publication has a very, very long history, and I think now NREA is giving that publication kind of the outreach that it warrants. I also have on the slide here a link, or I guess looks like it's a screenshot there of the National Rural Education agenda. You can check, oh, sorry, I'm sharing my screen, aren't I? You can check that out. And we are understanding the Why Rural Matters report as an equity report. So I hope that becomes clear as we go along. But first, let me kind of give you some more details about what this report actually is. So the data sources that you see here on the screen have a couple of things in common. And one is that they are all publicly available data sources. Anyone can replicate any finding that we will present in this report. So for example, we wouldn't take data, like we wouldn't contact like say National Education Association. We wouldn't reach out to NEA and say, do you have statistics on like, I don't know, average age of rural teachers or something like that? Because that wouldn't be publicly available for you as a non-author of the report. So that's a really good thing in the way that any of these results can be replicated by anyone at any time. But on the other hand, it does kind of limit the data that we can report out. But please, as you're listening, if you think of something that you wish that the report reported on, if you could just please let us know that, because very honestly, that's how these categories that you're about to see come to fruition. Someone says, well, I wonder about rural health, access to health insurance. Can we get a statistic on that? And then our team looks into it and either yes or no. So again, the data sources have to be publicly available that anyone can reproduce. And also they have to be aggregated by rural locale, right? That's another major requirement of our data. So you'll see that we report data on 5 what we're calling gauges. And those are the colored rectangles there. And within each gauge, we have 5 data points. So each state's ranking comes from an aggregated score for each of those 5 points in each of those gauges. Those together come in a priority ranking. So you'll see we tried to get at rural education, taking a really broad view, right? Achievement is one thing, that's educational outcomes, but of course, so is policy, student and family diversity and importance, access to support. So we tried to take as much as possible a very broad view of what rural education is. So now I'm going to transition to just presenting to you some Texas specific data. So here's that priority ranking, and my Zoom keeps on hiding things. 17 and major. So another thing to say here. So it means that the smaller the number, the greater the concern. It doesn't mean one is like winning, right? It doesn't mean that one is losing, but it means that when you look at all 25 data pieces and then you compare them to all other rural data across all the other states, 16 states are more of concern than Texas, right? So Texas is pretty high up there. And then we divide them into quartiles. And that's what you see there in the bottom right, notable, significant, major, and leading. So again, just to reiterate, when you see a ranking, like Texas is going to be 1, for example, for number of rural students. And so that doesn't mean they're winning or losing. It's just that that means that Texas has the most rural students of any state in the United States. So let's take a look. So the first gauge is importance. And this has to do with basically like the footprint of rural education in a state. So you can see here that Texas has a huge number of rural students, well above the US median of 94,000. And by median, we mean rural median, right? So all of these, when it says a median, it always means rural. So I want to call your attention here to something that is really interesting. If you look at the percent rural students and also the percent of education funds to rural districts. So you're looking like that lines up pretty well. So the percent rural students is 15.4. The percent of state funds going to those rural districts is almost about 17%. They both happen to rank exactly 31. So that means that comparative to other states, Texas is doing pretty well in terms of how a state is funding its rural students. But as we know, equal is not equitable, right? So it costs a lot more money to educate rural students. So even when we have something like 15 to 17, that looks pretty okay, but in reality, that is still deeply inequitable because of the costs involved in educating rural students, like, for example, transportation, example of having to share teachers among districts, that kind of thing, right? So equal doesn't necessarily mean equitable, but look here too, I found this really interesting. There's been an increase of 84,000 rural students in the state since the 1819 report. So your rural footprint is very, very big and it's also growing. And for those of you who are familiar with the state, you might have ideas about why that is. Is it because students are moving to rural places? Is it because the urban is losing population? We don't know, right? But 84,000 more, right? So your all rural population is growing, and that's not true in most states. So that is a little bit of an outlier for Texas. The next gauge is student family diversity. And no surprises here to you all. The diversity rank is 10. So that means that only 9 states have more diverse rural schools than Texas. But let me tell you what I mean by diverse. This is really important. By diverse, we mean the likelihood that two students randomly selected in a school will identify as a different race or ethnicity. We did not use diversity as a code for Black or a code for Latinx. We truly mean diverse in that students identify as different races and ethnicities. So as a school, for example, that is 97% Hispanic would score very low on this indicator. But in Texas, only 9 schools, only 9 states rather have more diverse schools. I thought that was really interesting. Also, and maybe you have thoughts about this, look at that percent rural students with the IEP. That is really low, right? So I wonder with numbers quite like 47, right, 47, does that suggest that there is an underrepresentation of rural students with disabilities in Texas schools? I don't know, right? But that's kind of what this report does really well, is that it says, okay, here's something interesting. Dig into that more, right? What research questions does that suggest? How could we think about that number within a more developed context of Texas that you can't get basically just by looking at these numbers? And the last one, again, is percent of rural household mobility. And I think that is defined as changing residences in 6 months. So I think it's a pretty, the bar is really high to be considered mobile, and only 8 states have students with more mobility than Texas. Let's take a look for a minute at Texas rural multilingual learners. So this map, I should say, is not rural specific. So in general, this is where multilingual learners live in the state, well, go to school in the state of Texas. You can see that the US average is 4.5%, and Texas rural, that figure is rural specific. That is almost 12%. So very, very high numbers of rural multilingual learners in the state. And since you all know the state really well, you could probably look at that map and see where the rural multilingual learners are in some of that dark orange. Gauge number 3 is a policy gauge. And here, I'll explain some of these things. Okay, so the first one is rural instructional expenditures per pupil. So Texas ranks 11, so that means that it's relatively low and of concern. So only 10 states have lower instructional expenditures per pupil than Texas. But what I really want to call your attention to, and this really goes together, is the state revenue to schools per local dollar. Texas is 65 cents, right? So that's very, very low. And that means that for every dollar received by the state, the local revenue is 65 cents, right? So, oh no, I'm sorry. It means that 65 cents from the state per local dollar. Yeah. So that means that there is a very high reliance on local property tax in the state. And just for the rural mean is $1.18. So you're significantly, as you would expect with a rank 7, under the rural mean. And look at Nebraska, 28 cents from the state per local dollar. And to me, these all goes together. Rural instructional expenditures per pupil is low, or rather rank high in priority. State revenue to schools, very high in priority. Adjusted salary expenditures per instructional FTE is 68,000. And for reference, you can see in the upper left there, New York's rural teachers earn about 110,000, and that is adjusted. So you all are very concerning at 68 versus New York. And also, I should say at the end of the report, you can see you can see data for all 50 states for each one of these gauges. So you can go to the end of the report and look at just the adjusted salary expenditures, and you'll see the rank from state number 1, which is going to be Nebraska, and state number 50, which is probably New York. So you can look at that at the end of the state pages. Educational outcomes really tend to mirror a lot of what we were seeing on that policy page. The rural NAEP composite ranks 17. That means that rural students in 16 states have lower rural NAEP composite scores in Texas. Same with composite reading. 9 states have rural NAEP composites below Texas. And let me take a minute to explain what the rural poverty difference is. So this is a measure of comparison between NAEP scores of students who live in homes below the poverty line as compared to those rural students who do not live in homes below the poverty line. So essentially what this is reporting is, how is Texas doing in math and reading grade 8 with students who live in homes below the poverty line? And the answer to that is okay, 29 and 38, comparatively not great, but significantly better for students in poverty than you are doing for rural all in those scores. And we know that rural schools are protective for students who live in homes below the poverty line. And the high school grad advantage, Texas does not report that data, but generally that means that if you looked at graduation rates between rural schools and non-rural schools, students overall graduate at higher rates in rural schools than they do in non-rural. But that data is was not available for this report. Okay, last one. This is access to supports for learning and development. And look at that, number 2, 13.5% of children in Texas do not have health insurance. And look at the public preschool data too. You're ranked 20, so that's pretty typical. But I think what I want to say about this is 30% of Texas students are enrolled in public preschool, and that's a rank 20. So that means that 70% of Texas students are not getting public preschool, and that's so low. Like I feel like, to me, a rank of 30% should be like a 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? But because across the board access to preschool is so low in rural communities, that 30% get public preschool, and that turns out to be kind of the median, right? That's kind of the norm, that 30% of our kids get public preschool. So overall, you are rank 10 in this gauge, and that is, that number 2 without health insurance is probably responsible for a lot of that because these look pretty, to the median overall. And this 337, I should say, that is a ratio. So that means every psychologist and school counselor, and the data did not allow us to separate those two, even though we know they have very different roles. So the caseload is 1 to 337, right? Again, so I would say rank 20, like, why is that median for one rural school counselor to have a caseload of 337 kids, right? But that's pretty typical across rural schools in the US. All right, let's pause. So looking across all the 5 gauges, what are you thinking about now that you weren't before? What was confirmed that you already knew? What was surprising? Let's just take a minute to pause and see what your response is. And if you need me to navigate
I
back to any of those gauges, I'm happy to do that.
um I'll just jump in. I wasn't too surprised, unfortunately, at a lot of the facts, just because I know one, how big Texas is, that there's going to be a large portion of students that are from rural areas. I was a little surprised at, and now I understand, especially because I just bought my first house, understanding property taxes and where they're going to and how that all works. So, but one thing that I forgive me if you mentioned it, but working with some folks at the University of Tennessee, one of the big things they were working with students to understand is food deserts. And so I'd be curious to know how that impacts our students across Texas, kind of where the food deserts are and what that looks like for students, because that obviously will impact their education as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that back to the team and see if that's possible. I love that idea.
Rebecca had a question in the chat about
Hmm.
the early childhood and preschool and health insurance numbers being low. And how low exactly are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a reaction of just, I'm assuming, is there any like understand? I know that you're just kind of working with the data, but like, is there a reason people are not insuring their children? I mean, they don't vaccinate them here. I know that's kind of a thing as well. Is that kind of part and parcel of that, or is it really just a dollar and cents, like we can't afford it versus I don't believe in it sort of thing? I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. That's a question for you all. You're familiar with the state. I mean, I tend to think immediately in my mind that it has to do with the type of jobs that people work. That if insurance isn't available to you because you're itinerant, because you're migrant, whatever the reasons are, then those rates are uh, you know going to be really depressed. But I'm sure there is a contingent. This doesn't doesn't want health insurance for whatever reason, but I would assume that's a pretty small minority.
I think you hit the nail on the head. You're right, because in rural communities here, most of the businesses are under 50. And if you have under 50 employees, you don't have to offer health insurance. You're right. You're 100% right.
And the new report coming out, oh, I should have said that. The new report is going to drop in November. And an indicator in that new report is access to primary care physician. So, right, we have insurance, that's great or not, but then can you get to a provider? Right, that's a different issue.
So one thing I would I think like the food desert question, the healthcare, like all of these, so the data in the Why Rural Matters report, we pull from other federal reports. Well, we still can. And take the slice for the most rural school districts in your state and just look at that subset from the data. And so one thing would be to like all those sources are linked in the main report. So like if you really did want to ever dig into the health insurance one, I'm sure somebody there like the data that comes from or would exist in the world and you could dig into it a little bit more. And this is just sort of like bringing all of those together to look at how it matters for rural schools.
I'm pretty sure that's the American Community Survey where that health
ACS.
insurance data comes from, and that is the off-year survey between the census.
Yeah.
Whether we have that moving forward is very unclear, but that's been the past where that data source is.
And Debbie asked a question, is there a correlation between mobility and low percent of home ownership and the funding of rural students? It kind of makes sense if you're collecting tax base and that tax base is moving or not paying a high percentage of taxes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, intuitively, I feel like yes. I don't
Well, I think it sort of depends on like if the people are mobile, but then who owns the land stays the same because there are companies or individuals that own large swaths of land that the people move around on and come and work and then leave. So the mobility probably leans to people being renters, and then somebody owns the land the renter's on and presumably pays some sort of property tax. But definitely our decision to base school funding on property taxes is one of the big policies that really impacts rural education. So I think a lot about my brother-in-law who teaches bilingual education in Passaic, New Jersey, where the school district is literally 1 square mile, the whole school district. And everybody walks to school, and all the kids, they're mostly Dominican, and they live in these high-rise apartments that pay a ton of property taxes, and the schools are very well funded. And then my district here in Starkville, Mississippi is 400 square miles, and we have fewer kids in that district than he does in 1 square mile of Passaic, New Jersey. And then we have federal land and we have university land, and none of them pay any property taxes. And so the property tax revenue we're able to generate is very different than in that urban setting. So I'm sure mobility is part of it because it probably depresses the value of the land as well. But
so that reminded me about fracking and oil in Texas. Do those companies pay what you would consider a fair share or something approaching a fair share in taxes? Do they get a bunch of exemptions? What is the role of oil in school funding in Texas?
Rachel shook her head.
Oh, you're muted.
I have no idea. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I would be very curious to know the answer. So
yeah.
I mean, if I were a guessing woman, we would assume Midland and Odessa, which is like the heartland, like where houses are, so expensive because they would have the best funded schools in the world. And they don't. So they can't even hold on to their teachers at present. So because of how, the current context is. So.
Yeah.
And some states, so I honestly don't know, I should have looked, but how it is in Texas, some states like mine, the property taxes that are local go to the local schools. Some states, you pay property taxes based on the value of your land, then it gets centralized, and then it gets redistributed to the schools in some sort of formula by the state government. So even though you're paying local property taxes, it doesn't necessarily directly benefit your local school district. So sort of like how that funding works is definitely something worth unpacking if you want to think about equitable funding across districts.
I wondered because that state revenue is so low, but also so is instructional spending. I just wonder if that's oil somehow in there, that the state revenue is low because there's a lot of support at the local level from oil. I don't know.
And that
But
would vary
also,
across parts of Texas too.
right. But I mean, also they're not spending much. So I mean, that
Yeah.
could be not on kids or teachers.
compared to what is it, 13,000 in Vermont and Massachusetts
Mm,
per pupil?
that sounds about right.
It's well over 10.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's your data.
Mhm.
And that data plays into how we think about rural education. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what NREA is advocating for right now and what are some of the big buckets of policy that we pay attention to as a organization, speaking from my position as the president of that association right now. NREA, of course, funds currently, has recently taken over the publishing of the Why Rural Matters report as one of our key initiatives. And then we engage in legislative advocacy, particularly at the federal level. And then we work with our state affiliates to do work in states. So I'll talk about that. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about a framework for thinking about policy, the rural critical policy analysis. So that's kind of where we're going from here. But please keep jumping in with comments or questions. It's way more interesting if it's a little bit of a dialogue. So there are some big pieces of federal legislation that largely impact rural education that we as an association care about. The biggest one is REAP, the Rural Education Achievement Program. Some of you may have heard of REAP. REAP has traditionally been a federal set aside for rural schools specifically. So a lot of the buckets of money that come from the federal government. And one thing I think it's important to remember in all of the conversations about the U.S. Department of Education and its role is that about 10% of school funding comes from the federal government. So 90% of what schools spend to educate kids is either local or state money or a combination. It's a combination of both, often about sort of 45, 45, 10. Anyway, so the Rural Education Achievement Program is a little pot of money specific to rural schools that are either serving a low-income population or very small, the small rural schools achievement program. And it recognizes that educating students in rural places is more expensive. So if you're 1 square mile, you don't need buses. But rural districts, the kids ride the buses for 50 minutes, so you've got additional transportation costs. If you have 4,000 students, you can afford to have a science director and a whole team of science teachers who teach each subject area. But in a rural school, you might just have one teacher who teaches 6 different subjects and has to be prepared to teach all those subjects, those kinds of things. And so the Rural Education Achievement Program is intended to offset some of the increased costs of being a rural school. It ends up being somewhere between $20,000 and $80,000 per district per year. So it's really not a huge pot of money, but it's an important one. The same with Secure Rural Schools. Secure Rural Schools is a piece of federal legislation that provides funding through counties through the U.S. Department of Agriculture for places where there are large patches of federal land that are national forests and those kinds of things. And so those areas don't pay property taxes, and Secure Rural Schools kind of offsets the cost of that. And that's one that hasn't been reauthorized in a while, and we are not sure the fate of it. The REAP, we were real worried about for a while, but the REAP application window is open now. I think they're due June 13th for districts to apply for that. Of course, IDEA for students with disabilities and Title I for low-income students in poverty. Those are big pots of money that really, if those are cut at the federal level, will impact rural schools. And the cost of meeting the needs of kids with disabilities in rural schools is really often prohibitive because there's not a big enough school population to make sure we have all of the unique services depending on what kids need. And so we often, as NREA, argue for full funding of IDEA. And then there is a lot of talk right now. We'll talk more about it when we think about state level stuff, but there's certain vouchers. I spelled it wrong. There's a certain amount of conversation at the federal level about how do we incentivize school vouchers and provide funding for privatization and those kinds of things. And we stand firmly against those as an NREA. If you are a rural district with 40 kids in each grade, and then vouchers come in and you lose 60 kids, that's the salaries of 2 teachers that maybe went away, but there are probably 60 kids, 4 from first grade, 3 from second grade, 2 from 10th grade, and so forth. And so how you keep meeting the needs of kids in all of your grades when the funding for those kids has followed them to whatever private school or school of choice they've gone to is one of the real challenges of vouchers for rural schools. And so it's something we worry about, and we're really dismayed at that trend in a lot of states, including Texas. We, as an REA, we were in DC in February, and at that point we were really talking about these school funding issues as well as the National Center for Education Statistics. So a lot of the data that Karen shared, and Karen's and the Why World Matter team ability to figure out which school, how that impacts rural schools in specific, depends on the National Center for Ed Statistics being able to identify which schools are rural and using the locale codes. And the National Center for Ed Statistics has lost a lot of its funding and most of its staff. And so their ability to do things like run the national assessment for the NAEP test and provide the statistics on schools and higher ed and all of the data that we rely on, that's really going to be curtailed in coming years. And it's really important for rural districts in particular. And we also support research and data to identify practices that support rural students. So not a lot of federal research takes place in rural schools. It's more expensive and more complicated to deal with 42 principals and get 42 different MOUs with 42 different school boards to collect enough data for your randomly controlled trial. And so a lot of times the research happens in urban districts that have a much larger population. And we don't necessarily know if those practices will work with the resources available in local places. Karen and I have written about this a couple of times. And so funding that specifically addresses education research in general is in jeopardy and has been cut. And then, but specific to rural schools is something that we're really fighting for. And then we know rural districts really face teacher shortages. And so all of the federal programs for like teacher quality partnerships and loan forgiveness and those kinds of federal programs, as well as for career tech ed and the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, are all things that impact rural and that we care about as NREA. Happy to talk about any of those in more detail. Yeah, go ahead. So it's really interesting to see from the president's point of view how much NREA's voice is being contributed. So just in the last 6 weeks, I think we've signed on to letters about broadband access and its import for rural schools, about post-secondary education, financial aid and student aid. SNAP-Ed is the USDA legislation that provides for the school nutrition program, and Title II is around professional development. IDEA Part C is services for young children prior to coming to school who have disabilities for identification and treatment well before they get to school. All of these are really big challenges in rural places. All of these are things NREA has been asked to join the letter and sign on. All of these there's so many things happening at the federal level that have a specific impact or are vital to the well-being of rural education. And so trying to join that. So yeah, that. And then, of course, there are state and local policies. So in general, both at the federal level, but particularly at the state level, it would be great if policies would recognize that post-secondary and K-12 education institutions in rural places are not just education providers. They do so much more than just provide learning. They are often the economic anchor in a rural community. So if there's, a handful of businesses that employ less than 50 people, your school district might very well be the biggest employer in your community. And certainly the people coming to carpool or driving to attend an event, when they stop at the gas station and they get some chicken on a stick from the a gas station food counter, like they're keeping that business alive because they're going back and forth to the school. So schools are such economic anchors in rural communities and are often not a part of economic development plans in ways that really recognize their role, as well as the social drivers in communities. They're the place where people come together for football and other events and get to know each other across the community. And so if we think of schools as an economic and social as well as educative heart of communities, we might form different policies in order to help those communities thrive. We know that when we're thinking about rural policy, the factors of rural schools, like being smaller just in general, has all kinds of implications that people who work in big cities and set policy in our state capitals don't understand. Geographic distance from things like libraries and medical facilities and where the kids live, all of that geographic distance is really important for thinking about for rural schools. In rural schools, a lot of times people wear multiple hats. So Melissa Sadorf, who's the new director of the National Rural Ed Association, used to be a superintendent on a school in rural Arizona on the edge of the reservation. And she was the superintendent. She was also the high school principal. And I'm pretty sure for a while, she was also teaching one section of a science class. So she played all those roles in that district. I think there were like 90 kids in the whole district. So especially in small schools, people wear a ton of hats. And so as you work with your rural districts in Texas, you may find that there's in Mississippi, our schools have all been consolidated so much. We don't have that many tiny schools anymore, but these other factors apply. Certainly teacher shortages are a huge challenge for rural schools. We've already talked about the property tax funding model. And I've sort of listed a list of challenges, but also rural schools are really unique in terms of their role in the community and the resourcefulness of the community members. Lonnie Crum and her colleagues, they talk about a rural cultural wealth framework that emphasizes resiliency and familialism and ingenuity as characteristics often of rural people that we can leverage. And if we look for assets in rural places, we'll find them. And policy should recognize and strengthen those assets rather than destroy them. Yeah. So some of the state policies that most impact rural education are school choice and vouchers. This is two maps from the Learning Policy Institute about the location of public and private schools in Texas in 2021. As Texas rolls out more choice and voucher programs, it will be very interesting to see if and how this map changes. So that's why I put it there. And certainly consolidation and school closure are also issues. Mara Tikin in particular is a person who's done a lot of research around school consolidation and school closure. But one of the things that we know is often policymakers in our state capitals think, well, these two schools have gotten very small. They can't afford to provide band and music and cool things for their students. And so if we consolidate them, we'll save a lot of money. We'll reduce our number of administrators, et cetera, et cetera. And often that is not the case. In addition to sort of if schools get closed, destroying what is often the heart of the community, it often does not save any money. You have just as much administrative need to serve all those students. You have even greater transportation expenses. If you take 3 high schools and fold them into one, you got to build a new building, all these things. And so in general, you don't save as much money as was hoped for when policy happens. I will say, I think consolidation is a complicated issue in Mississippi. We have a lot of school districts where the boundaries were artificially drawn in the 1950s to keep the white students from the black students. And so we have sort of schools that aren't officially segregated, but are unofficially segregated by where the school boundaries lie. And when those districts get consolidated, if they get consolidated carefully and well, we destroy those sort of artificial racist boundaries from 40 and 50 and 60 years ago. But that doesn't always happen. And so really looking at the context when you're talking about that is important. If you're working with districts that are facing school closure, there's a website called Oh, as soon as I started that sentence, I knew I couldn't land it. It's Mara Tikans. What is it, Karen? It's I'll put it in the chat in a few seconds. But it's a rural school closure website, and it's about fighting to keep your school open. And then if you do have to close it, how do you close it well so that you don't devastate the community? Anyway, other state policies that impact rural schools' ability to address their teacher shortages are things like licensure requirements, which we're often seeing dismantled in a way that may or may not support rural students. Because we both don't want to lower expectations and requirements, but we do need to find ways to make the teaching profession available to people that live in rural places and get folks into rural classrooms. Infrastructure is always a huge one for schools, and that's often a state decision about providing money for new buildings and renovations, and then things that foster school and community partnerships are key policy issues at the state level that impact rural. So much information. One more slide, I think. Will you bump us one more? The last one. So the Bloomsbury Handbook of Rural Education in the United States, if you're interested in sort of a research lit reviews around all kinds of topics that impact rural ed, one of them is the Rural Critical Policy Analysis. And when we talk about rural critical policy analysis, we're talking about asking 4 questions about, is a policy place neutral? And most of them are. Most of them are not specific. Things like REAP are obviously rural specific. Most policies are just like, we will provide X amount of funding per kid, or we will require signs about the Constitution in classrooms or whatever. They assume place neutral, but they don't always recognize the diversity and the needs of rural schools. So when we make a policy, for example, that says you must assess the reading ability of every student in this way in 3rd grade, does the rural school have the capacity to do that? Is there a person who can manage that work? Is there the funding available to implement it? Does it assume things that might be in the community that do or don't exist? And so when we start from a place neutral point of view, we often will, whatever is the opposite of privilege, rural schools will often harm rural schools. And then sort of you can often take a policy and look at things like distributive analysis. So I think Why Rural Matters kind of does that across states, but does the impact of a specific policy vary by geography, sort of rural versus non-rural, and map out a policy and look at where will the funding go, who will it go to, is it sufficient, those kinds of things. And so that distributive analysis can be really important. And then I think it's also really important to do distributive analysis if you're going to do this kind of work, not just across comparing rural to non-rural, but also comparing within rural. What about rural and multilingual rural and Hispanic rural? And so looking at within rural communities, how a policy might have an impact. A lot of policies aim to fix something about rural places that may or may not be broken. So there's a lot of assumption that rural places don't know what they're doing, don't know how to run their lives, and that we from the outside should come in and fix them. I think about, it's been a minute, but when Biden was first running for office, his rural strategy group wrote up a plan for rural America. And that plan for rural America started out with this sentence. I just looked it up recently. It started out with this sentence: rural places are really important. They give us clean water to drink and food to eat and a place to go on vacation. I kid you not. I kid you not. So this extractive assumption about rural places as they do not know how to run their lives. We know how to run their lives better, so that we can take from them the resources that exist and use them in the city where the real people are, is often sort of a mindset of across all the aisles and in all of the parties about rural places. And it makes you kind of better understand when you see that language. Now, they very quickly, I wrote them a letter, they didn't reply to me, but they did. Future versions of that plan did not have that language in it. Like that went away pretty quickly, but it's how they started. And it's kind of an underlying assumption about a lot of policies, especially those that get put out to fix rural places. And so you need to see, do they know about and understand rural context? Do they assume that there are assets in rural places and those are worth preserving and strengthening? And finally, is there a local input in a policy? Were any rural educators involved in defining what the problem is or proposing a solution? And often they're not. And so when people in the center in a big city, in our capitals, fix something, if they haven't talked to their rural administrators and their rural faculty, they may not understand our reality and they may be fixing a problem that doesn't need to be fixed with a solution that won't work. So that's that. James asked a question, instead of consolidation, do we see shared service agreements? And yes, a lot of the rural education or the regional education service agencies or the intermediate school district, from state to state, it really varies how well those work, how political those might be, whether there's funding in place to do it. But I do think that is a really good solution around hiring or school psychologist services or career tech ed, those kinds of services that keeps the heart of the rural school district and the community, but also provides financial and logistical support. Sue asked a really hard and important question about how does the rural critical policy analysis framework address power relations in policy processes? Like, how is it similar to or different from other critical policy? And in the chapter I wrote a little bit about that. Like, in my mind, it builds on all of those. So the critical policy frameworks ask a lot of these questions already, but specific. When we layer in the element of geography and the geospatial equity and the geospatial justice, that's where it comes in. And then recognizing a long history, which Karen can talk about way more eloquently than me, of extractive assumptions about rural places as in service to urban places, then it's really important to layer in that piece of looking at how does it vary by place. And it's 5 minutes till, so thank you all.
Excellent.
Happy to
Thank
keep
you so
talking about any of
much.
this over email. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. So we do have just a couple more minutes. Does anyone want to ask a question about the totality of the presentation, or do they have any thoughts or thinking that's kind of arisen from this discussion?
Do you notice anything specific about West Texas that might be different from the rest of Texas, or what might be different from other rural communities across the nation, or any place that might be similar to West Texas?
You reminded me of something that I wanted to say and I didn't, and that is, while this report does a really good job of comparing rural Texas to rural Pennsylvania or wherever else, what it does not do is report on within rural differences in a state. So it can highlight needs and challenges and assets, but it also in some ways can obscure really important within rural differences in a state. So that would be, I hope, where you pick up that data. So if there's something particular about West Texas, but you looked at the state figure and to you that doesn't sit quite right, well, it's probably because it's not, right? It probably does not represent West Texas well.
Right. West Texas has many more remote rural.
Yeah.
Sure. And that's another like the
Right.
report does not differentiate between rural, fringe, and distant. If
Right.
it's rural, it's rural. Right. So
The other thing, the Why Rural Matters report does not include like small town.
right.
So it's those 41, 42, and 43. So it probably is more representative of West Texas than it is of the small towns 40 minutes from Austin or whatever might exist in other parts of the state, because it is limited to the very most rural districts in your state. So like Starkville, where I am, is a small town. countywide school district, which I think of as pretty rural, but would not be included in the report.
Right. Okay.
But your state, I know Texas has 2 state associations, but I know that the Texas Rural Ed Association, these are issues that they work on, and so they may have some information about that.
Mhm.
We have time for one more, if there's any final thought or question.
I will say, if you are not a member of NREA, the weekly newsletters have a ton of information. If you are a researcher and you are interested in joining the community of rural ed researchers, our Facebook group is pretty active. The special interest group of AERA has a great meeting every year and is a place where rural educators come together in the newsletter, the SIG newsletter. So if you're in AERA and you haven't joined the Rural SIG, you should. And of course, the Rural Educator is the journal of the National Rural Ed Association, and Karen is on the Journal of Research in Rural Ed, and both of them are always, always, always looking for reviewers who will do a great job reviewing, and you can sign up at the Rural Ed Educator website to be a reviewer, which will help you understand the journal and get published if that's something you're interested in. So,
And submissions, please submit to those.
yeah, to us.
For JRE, we have more of a need probably the submissions than
Reviewers.
Yeah, I tend to pull the reviewers from folks who have published in the
Gotcha.
journal. But yes, please reach out. Please check out the websites. They're both free and open access, and they will stay that way when JRE will stay that way when it moves to K-State.
Fantastic. Well, once again, thank you so much for being here. We really deeply appreciate your time and expertise as we here in West Texas continue on our never-ending journey of championing public education in West Texas and in rural areas.
Hopefully you all recover quickly from last night's tornadoes.
Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, I think it's impacting a lot of infrastructure right now.
I wondered, yeah.
But thank you for still being here. If you didn't see it in the chat, everyone, if you would, thank you for attending. And there is a short evaluation. If you could just click on that before you leave the Zoom and just answer a couple of short questions, that will really help us understand the impact of our work, and of course, tailor future brown bags to your scholarly interests. Thanks, everybody.